And with a rebel yell, she cried, more, 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 Stick to Wrestling podcast. Welcome to the show. My name is John McAdam. If it's too loud, you're too old to figure out how to adjust the volume on whatever device you're listening with. I'm almost that old. Anyway, a casual fan will hate this show, but if you're into old school wrestling, give us 60 minutes and we will give you a wicked good podcast. I would now like to bring on my convivial co-host, Mr. Sean Goodwin. Sean, how are you?
And if you like minutia, because we go through these tapes like there's Bruta films. So, I mean, if there's something there, we're going to find it. And also, if you're a fan of the show, you also want to be a fan of our Facebook page. It's a kind of companion piece. And also you learn about yourself. And I learned that I'm grumpy. But, and sometimes you have to face hard facts. And I'm from Boston. We're a grumpy people. We start revolutions. That's what we do. So you learn about yourself and you talk to some nice folks about old school wrestling. Good time had by all.
Yes, I agree with that. And for a minute there, I thought you said, and if you're into menudo, I was like, where's this guy going? But apparently
no. Yes.
All right.
Minutia.
On the Facebook page, we actually had a pretty good conversation. It started with me saying, hey, apparently Rocky Johnson is close to getting into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. And I just put something up like, look, I was a big fan of Rocky, but I don't think he's a Hall of Famer. And it brought on a good discussion. So that's a good idea of what you'll be expecting. If you sign up, all you have to do is get on Facebook, do a search on Stick to Wrestling, and you're there. This week, if you are not part of the Facebook group, you are incentivized to join it. And if you are part of it, you want to occasionally check in. Hint, hint. And what I contribute every day, I try to do this, is to put up results from 40 years ago to this day, because amazingly enough, results mattered in 1979, and they kind of stopped mattering by 1989. But anyway, follow me on Twitter. It helps my ego when I get new followers. I think I've turned into a pretty decent follow because I retweet cool stuff. My handle, just look up John McAdam. There's a guy hitting another guy with a chair, and you are there. One last thing. A couple of weeks ago, if you enjoy this show, I think you'll enjoy this. I did the Mid-South Wrestling television review. It was me and my longtime friend Ricardo Coleman doing the year-end review for 1982. So that's part of our Arcadian Vanguard, which means it's going to be really good. Check it out if you enjoy this show. Sean, for a minute, I'm not going to stick to wrestling. Halloween. When did this happen that Halloween turned into like an 8-week extravaganza? I was watching television the weekend of September 13th and 14th. They're having Halloween candy commercials. I've got people all around where I live with Halloween decorations already up. What's going on?
There should be laws. Now, I know people are going to be upset, and Halloween's just great when it happens because it's cold. Okay, I have no desire to rush the cold any faster than it's getting here. Okay, let it get here when it gets here. Halloween's fun. At the end of October.
Yeah, one day is Halloween.
That's it. If you want to make it a week at the end of October, that's fine. But I don't want to hear about it before then. Yeah.
This is insane. And if you're someone who's listening and you've put your Halloween decorations out and you're offended, take them down, you psycho. That's all I got. We have a new guest for the Stick to Wrestling podcast. Good friend of mine through Facebook, cool guy, grew up in the Carolinas watching Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, and that's what this podcast is going to be about. Welcome, Mr. Tyler Judd. Tyler, thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Tyler, tell us a little bit about yourself, like as a wrestling fan. When did you start watching? When did you become like a hardcore fan, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I live in the Carolinas now, specifically Charlotte, suburban Charlotte, but I grew up in Virginia, kind of in between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. And Richmond, of course, was I was getting a Crockett feed from there. That was Crockett territory. DC, we were getting the WWF stuff out of New York. And so the shows were all at the Cap Center up that way, Baltimore. And then, of course, Virginia was full of Crockett, spot shows and main shows like Richmond. But I started watching, I would say it would have been about late 82, early 83. And then really right around the beginning of 84 is when, the hook was really set with me, especially with the Crockett stuff coming hot off of Starrcade.
Oh, yeah.
But some of my earliest memories are the Flair and Bob Orton Jr. Angle with Slater and Harley Race, of course. That's some of my earliest memories that really just the chaos is what attracted me to it. At that time, I was born in 75, so that would have been 8, 9 years old. So been a fan ever since.
That seems to be a pretty common age. And yeah, you were a young kid. Did you ever wonder, like you're living in Virginia, you've got Crockett going on. Did you ever wonder like why one promotion ran shows where you lived and the other one kind of didn't? Yeah, really. But somewhat. The Richmond station was a local station. We used to get, it wasn't a cable station, but I used to watch WWF on what was called WDCA Channel 20, which ended up turning into a UPN network. So that to me seemed like a bigger time network than the local Richmond channel did. So it kind of seemed like the WWF was on a little bit of a different level from production values and things like that. So. Yeah. Growing up in the sticks, I knew why somebody like the WWF wasn't coming anywhere near where I was, but wasn't so much a factor or a thought at that time. All right, I can see that. Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to talk about Mid-Atlantic Wrestling from about 35 years ago and kind of using the Mid-Atlantic TV, which is on WWE Network, as a guide from September. We're going to start with the September 22nd, 1984 show. Sean, let me hand the baton to you.
All right, let me just give you a quick rundown of what happened. I'm sure we've all seen the Mid-Atlantic show, so you can kind of get a visual. Psychedelic opening. David starts. David's doing this show solo, which is a nice contrast with Bob coming up later. Starting off, we got Brian Adidas, who I guess is new to the area, against Paul Kelly. It looks like an Adidas-Paul Kelly match. David has an interview with Paul Jones in the Zambui Express. Big Dust makes an appearance. He's dancing with the fans. David yells, "Shake it, Dusty!" I don't remember what the song was. I think it may have been Old Time Rock and Roll. Dusty beats Doug Vine. I couldn't hear David say it, but John said it was Doug Vine. The Assassin #1 against Sam Houston. This was a good match. He gave Sam Houston some serious offense here, but this was a good, tough. This was your classic Mid-Atlantic squash, where just a good physical match. The Long Riders with JJ in an interview segment. Ivan and Dawn versus Bret Hart and Mike Fever. Bret Hart here is Barry Horowitz. Interview segment with Dusty. One of those that if you wrote it down, it doesn't make any sense at all, but when you hear Dusty say it, it's inspiring. And then we finish off with the Gruesome Twosome. Tully and Wahoo against Dennis Brown and Keith Larson. We had one more. And one more match is Black Bart versus the newly returning Mike Rotundo. Bart is the Ron Bass, who is the Mid-Atlantic champion against the newly arriving Mike Rotundo. Let me start here, Tyler. This was an angle that I remember Mike, I think 3 years ago, did something with Bad Leroy Brown, where he was trying to prove himself. And basically he made his reputation by having a series of great matches, tough matches against this guy. They bring him in against Ron Bass, who's the defending Mid-Atlantic champion, and they seem to be doing the same thing. What do you remember about Mike at this time? And do you remember the 81 push?
No, 81 was a little bit before my time. I didn't see that in live time, but it did seem like they, were gearing up maybe for something with him and Barry together. But Barry Windham, who was there at the same time, they were gone not shortly after this, if I'm not mistaken, up to New York.
No, you are correct. Barry, as a matter of fact, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but yeah, Barry was complaining that the paychecks were not very good, which is a real surprise to me. He was saying that he was making like $200 a week or something like that, and he was used to the big money down in Florida. Let me share an observation about Mike Rotundo with you guys and tell me what you think. I thought Mike Rotundo, had he been born 10 years earlier, would have been in the mix for the NWA title. Here's a guy who had a legit amateur background at Syracuse, which the NWA loved that kind of thing. He played defensive end at Syracuse. He had a good look. It was almost like he came out too late. Tyler, what do you think?
I tend to agree because at this point, I mean, they were really starting to transition into, some flashier guys. I mean, I think Dusty, when he came in, he kind of went with some guys he could trust. I mean, you had the Assassin in who Dusty had been with years in Florida, Ron Bass, another guy. But, they were starting to get to a little bit more, where the promos were meaning maybe a little bit more. And I think Rotundo was struggling to keep up at that point because I think the emphasis was being sort of transitioned from, and not transition, but you had to talk in Mid-Atlantic. I mean, everybody there could talk. I mean, and Rotundo just really struggled in that area.
Sean, your thoughts?
I think the more I used to think that too, what Tyler was saying too, but the more I'm seeing this, the more I'm starting to think that this is a square peg in a round hole. Mike's not a face. I think Mike's a heel. And I think if you made Mike a heel earlier, he would have been much better off. Stylistically, I think you're both right about the age thing. I mean, if you put him back in 1968, he's Dory Funk Jr., basically. Yeah. That kind of I think Mike has more personality as a heel, but I would have liked to have them try Mike as a heel this early and see what would have happened, because he seems much more natural on these promos, whether it's IRS, even that ridiculous character, or even especially the captain with the varsity club. I just don't think he was one of these guys who just couldn't be a face very well, couldn't do the face promo.
I thought he did an effective face promo, especially, like I said, if he had been doing what he was doing in 1979 instead of 1984, I think he would have been big. I think he would have been, I mean, really even a possible contender for the WWF title, because he had the same style as Bob Backlund.
Right. And his finisher was the airplane spin. I mean, how much more old school do you get than that, right? So.
Really? That was something we might have needed to change up if we wanted to talk about Mike being a world heavyweight champion.
Right.
We mentioned the opening match, Paul Kelly against Brian Adidas. I actually saw Paul Kelly in like the end of Southwest Championship Wrestling. It might have already turned into Texas All-Star Wrestling. The guy, he could do a good promo. Like, he got a little bit of a push here, but dude, you need to find that bench press and get on it.
Yeah, absolutely. You had that time too where you're under your carpenters or job guys, whatever your preferred term is. A lot of those guys were really good workers because at the time Crockett was letting those guys go on the B shows and they were going 20 minutes a night with another guy. I mean, so they were being paired up with a Keith Larson or a Doug Vines or whatever in the opening match. And so those guys were getting a chance to work every night. And so most of those guys could really put out some decent matches if they were given the opportunity. So, cosmetically, to be in the right position, if your number gets called like Sam Houston's did, you really had to have that look and be ready to go, and so he certainly could have benefited from that.
Excellent point that he was getting work every night out there, 20 minutes a night, learning the trade. Go ahead, Sean.
My issue with Adidas is if we're going to get on Rotundo for having no personality, my God, the guy has the excitement of eggshell paint. Yeah. I mean, and without the cover of his little buddies, the Von Erich brothers, he looks a lot less interesting now. I mean, did they end up ever doing anything with him, Tyler?
No, he wasn't there very long, and he was gone. I think he was there maybe a year. He never really, I don't remember any programs he was involved in. I think he was just maybe a little too bland. But I don't recall anything of note that Brian Adidas ever did in the Crockett area at all.
I took a look at this match, and for the first time, I was like, wow, I could see this guy like maybe getting somewhere like 2 or 3 years down the road. He had a good look. I guess that's about all. He was okay in the ring, but he's someone that I would have looked at if I was watching that show 35 years ago. I would have been like, wow, I might buy stock in this guy, but it never happened for Brian Adidas, obviously. And I think, obviously, I think he was used well in Mid-Atlantic in that small role. I think he was fine in World Class as Kerry's little buddy in the Texas Heavyweight Championship. But I think that was his ceiling. And when they tried to make him a star by turning him, whoops, congratulations, you're a minor league promotion.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you can always tell Dusty's taken over the book because Sam Houston starts to get pushed.
No, go ahead, Sean.
I mean, it's just, and I like Sam, and I like the way they push him here, which is basically, they show his tough guy rep, like they did with Tommy Rich years earlier, where they have him just basically have the assassin beat the crap out of him. And I mean, and this was physical. They got the camera in there. You heard it. You heard him roughing the guy up, and it was kind of this earning your respect, and he did it well. And he actually kicked out of one of Jody's finishers with, that doesn't happen too often, especially with the enhancement talent.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and one thing about Sam, I looked it up. He was 20 years old at this point, which surprised me. I thought he was going to be like 18. Tyler, do you remember, how did they introduce him? Did they say like he was, I don't know, a kid out of a local high school or something, or did they just throw him out there?
No, I mean, as far as I remember, Sam basically came out like he did in this show, and that there was no, I don't ever remember any talk about him being Grizzly Smith's son or Jake's brother. They just kind of sent him out there, and he was in as a prelim guy, but not to jump ahead, but I don't know if you caught this, but, he was in regular boots, trunks. The following week, he started going into the cowboy gimmick. So his gimmick was starting to evolve, like right as we were watching this. And I don't really ever remember him being anything other than, sort of a competitive undercard guy, but I don't really remember any color being provided to his history and before that period.
I mean, he was still kind of the fall guy when he left in 1986. And when he showed up in Mid-South, I mean, he was really good. Bill Watts was letting him, show us what he had, and he looked like he was going to be a future star. I would have known that he was going to fill out the same way that, everyone in their 20s in wrestling fills out eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think one of the things, too, with Sam Houston, he kind of got lost. I mean, like, how many cowboy gimmicks can you have at one time? I mean, you had Ron Bass, you had Dusty doing sort of the quasi-cowboy thing. Barry Windham's there. I mean, is he going to stand out in front of those three guys? I mean, maybe not so much Ron Bass, but Dusty and Barry. And, so it was kind of easy for him to not, stand out amongst other folks kind of because of the route he went with the chaps and the vests and the cowboy, pull-on boots and what have you.
Oh, and then Dusty gave Ricky Steamboat a pair of cowboy boots on TV, which Ricky in real life just didn't want any part of. So, Sean, any thoughts from you on Sam Houston?
Well, they always seem to kind of be feeling it. The use of Sam Houston here and up through 85 kind of reminds me, I don't know if you guys are going to get the reference, but the use of Dallas Montgomery in 1981 in Memphis, where they keep seeming to try to get him into the main event mix, and he could never seem to make the leap. They seem to want to get him about, like, there was one stretch where they were putting him with Nelson Royal. Now that may not sound like a big deal. It was a big deal in Mid-Atlantic because Nelson Royal was a legit big name. So they're putting him with Weaver or Royal, they're trying to get you over. So because they're trying to get that rub, and he could never seem to get past that level for some reason.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things once you are typecast as a jobber, sometimes it is hard to get over. And I remember when Sam was in the WWF, people were still saying, oh, he's too skinny. It's like, no, look at him. He's big now. He's not the guy he was back in 1985. But people couldn't get over what he was in 1985. Ivan Koloff and Don Kernodle against Bret Hart, who is Barry Horowitz, and Mike Fever. I used to know Mike Fever. He, about 20 years ago, he wrote to me and asked me for some, footage of himself, which I was happy to send him. And he was a cool guy. He had a lot of interesting stories. He's one of these guys that probably should have written a book, because sometimes the guys who have the smaller roles are the most observant and they have the best stories. But I hope Mike's doing good. He told me that I don't know if you guys remember Jimmy Holiday, the manager from who was in Florida managing Ron Bass. Well, actually, he wasn't managing Ron Bass. He was managing other people for J.J. Dillon, but that was Mike Fever said that was his brother. So interesting little fact there. Let me ask you this, Tyler. Don Kernodle gets a big push in 1982 and 1983 in Mid-Atlantic as half of the tag team championships with Slaughter. Comes to the WWF and has this bizarre run where he is just a prelim guy. Shows up about the same time Slaughter showed up. Then he goes back to Mid-Atlantic, and he is a tag team champion not only with Bob Orton Jr., but now with Ivan Koloff. Now, as someone, I can't wait to hear this because you have a unique perspective. You got WWF on TV. You saw what was going on in one promotion and how Kernodle was being presented in another promotion. I mean, what were your thoughts at the time?
Well, I mean, it definitely takes the shine off of a guy. I mean, the whole, if you looking bad on your way out doing the job, or you always hear about people not, they got their Japan money, so they don't want to do a job on TV or whatever, or in the magazines. I mean, it was legit because, I mean, for me, seeing Kernodle come back, I mean, it was like he's just another guy. Where he had been, that feud with Steamboat and Youngblood, and the blow off the blow off in the cage with Slaughter and him. I mean, it was just fantastic. I mean, they seemed like top echelon guys, and then definitely the shine gets knocked off of him when he comes back. But the one thing for me, it was always kind of easy to, what do they say, suspend disbelief or whatever. So it didn't take long to get back for me, but I could definitely see how people would never take him seriously after that.
Yeah, it's like he didn't even get like an Iron Mike Sharp level push. It was like he was a total jobber. Sean, what are your thoughts?
If anyone deserves to be annoyed, it's this guy. There's no reason why this guy could not have been in the TV title mix for years to come. He is absolutely insufferable here, as usual. He's one of those guys who likes being a heel. And it's really guys who kind of relish it. You just don't see that as much anymore. But it really is like, I mean, Don it's absurd. He's ridiculous. And you just immediately get annoyed when he starts talking. And there's no reason. He is a guy who's done great work and never got the due he deserved.
I got to see some Kernodle matches from 1986 when he was pretty much just totally written off. And the guy was a spectacular worker. He really was. He wasn't just good. He was really good. And I mean, to this day, over 30 years later, I find it sad that no one could find a role for him, like a Midnight Express role with another guy who was really good. And I understand that, look, we can't have 10 Midnight Expresses around for every, guy who's not really charismatic and doesn't talk that well. But I'm just saying Kernodle could have had more.
He has more of a reason to be mad than Terry Taylor does, because at least Terry made money off that gimmick.
Very true. Let's talk about Dusty. His promo He obviously he in this promo he is building up for, he knows what's going to be the main event of Starrcade. Him and Ric Flair, and he's building that up. One thing I noticed, now Dusty came in, my understanding is he signed a 5-year deal at $2.5 million total, so that's $500,000 a year to wrestle and book. And yeah, he's Dusty Rhodes. He's legitimately one of the elite baby faces in the game. So it's not like at this point he's overbooking himself. But one thing I noticed during this promo, Dusty has his own T-shirt. Like, Dusty's ahead of the game as far as like the merchandising goes.
Was it that, or is he just a big mark for himself?
It's both. And I think Dusty could be way too much of a mark for himself. At the same time, I think if you're going to be in the wrestling business, to some extent, you almost have to be. Sean, what do you think?
Electrified, funk personified. Okay, so before Dusty walks in the first time, he goes, Mr. Charisma, Mr. Boogie, Mr. Everything, Dusty Rhodes. And I'm sitting there picturing Dusty out back on, okay, David, so this is how you're going to say it, baby. It's just, okay, I get you have to get him over and everything like that. But it's, he's in the stands dancing. John is trying to convince me that David actually did mention Dusty's opponent in the match here. I listened to it twice. I still didn't hear it, but it was, the whole point was they were just went right by the fact that the guy even existed. It was like, one time Dusty's dancing and David's just yelling, "Shake it," like he's at a strip club. It's so ridiculous. At least when Bob got there, everything got back to normal. But with David there, it just doesn't matter.
Now, here's something I need Tyler's perspective on. 1984, it's called a year of transition. And was it, an amazing year of transition. Like, you see the guys who had been there forever, and a lot of them are now gone, and we've got these new wrestlers taking their place. What was it like for you witnessing that? Like, witnessing Dusty Rhodes coming in and basically taking over the television?
Well, it was pretty crazy because, first live show I ever went to, the main event was Greg Valentine versus Dick Slater. And it's when they were having that feud over the U.S. title. And, shortly Valentine was gone. Steamboat, had came back in, but those guys were starting to fade away. And that was kind of my first exposure to guys kind of leaving the program and going to elsewhere. And then, a lot of them were showing up in New York or what have you. But it never, to me, the excitement never went away from the program. Although in watching this back, I was kind of surprised. It almost seemed, from my memories, that there was a lot more going on, but there wasn't a lot of angles going on TV yet. And Dusty was always famous for the angle on TV. And yeah, there were obviously programs, but there weren't a lot of angles going on. But, in watching it, it was still really exciting. So I don't think it really fazed me too much that guys were leaving as much as getting excited as I was excited to see some new guys come in, because by then I'd found the aftermags and I knew who some of these names were, like Barry Windham and Ron Bass and guys like that. So it was kind of more excitement on my end to see new guys coming in than disappointment to see the older guard go away.
All right. That makes a lot of sense. Let me see. Sean, what would you like to talk about next?
Well, we have to mention that Dusty did challenge Ali, and he said that Ali turned him down because of his, quote, flip, flop, and fly.
Oh,
so, just for the record, so that gets out there. We get to my favorite tag team of the year at this point. Tully and Wahoo, bringing the awesome. This is Tyler. This is at the beginning of this, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, Wahoo, that whole program is quite interesting because, and one of the things, they interviewed, it might be the next week, but they interviewed Wahoo. And one of the things he said, it was really, and if you don't want me to jump ahead yet, I won't, but, Wahoo had been kind of a mainstay there and may have easily been one of the top 2 or 3 most popular people in the Mid-Atlantic area forever at that point. but he had a couple of times where, he had been the U.S. champion, kind of got, lost the title on technicalities. So the continuity of that storyline over a couple of years, and it must have been Wahoo. I'm not sure, because Dusty wouldn't have booked it originally. I guess it would have been George Scott to where they had the 3-man crew of Dory and Gary Hart who was the third guy? Derry Hart and Ernie Ladd, I think, were booking, and then on into this. So this kind of transcended all three of those. And but Wahoo kept getting kind of screwed out of the title. He wasn't getting pinned, but he would lose it or would get held up or whatever. And it got held up again after he beat Steamboat, which of course Tully interfered, hit Steamboat with the chair, and Wahoo didn't see it but pinned him. And so supposedly the storyline, Jimmy Crockett sent the tape off to Bob Gaggle, who made a decision on it and said, we got to hold the title up. That's not a clean victory. And so that was the third time Wahoo had seemingly won the title or had held the title, and it got stripped of it. So he kind of gets to the point where he's sort of fed up with it. Flair won't face him, supposedly, because Flair had, he was going back and forth with Dick Slater and other guys. And so Wahoo's finally like, well, at least Tully, I got respect for him. At least he'll show up and give me a match. And so that's kind of how those guys got together. And so it was sort of the grouchy old Wahoo who just was, he's been there for a long time and he deserves to get treated better than this. And he was done with it. I mean, I think everybody's probably been there. So it's a real relatable, angle. And I thought it was just brilliant the way they kind of called back to the earlier years where Wahoo was stripped of the title. That same belt.
Yeah, I mean, I've said in the past that Wahoo to me was one of those guys that he never turned. However, I always enjoyed that storyline where a wrestler turns heel slowly, and you can see where he's coming from. Like, yep. Wahoo gets stripped of the United States title because of outside interference, and he's like, wait a minute, when was the last time a title got stripped from someone because of outside interference? Why just me? So you can see why he's frustrated. And then, of course, almost like Larry Zbyszko a few years earlier. And then, of course, Wahoo just says screw it and goes full on heel and doesn't care anymore.
The thing I loved about this was, again, it was just the little details, because Tyler was right. He was saying, well, Tully, I can get shots with Tully. He also said that about Ricky, though. Steamboat as the U.S. champion. So it didn't look like he was going with the heels. He was just saying, look, these guys are giving me shots. So everyone else give me shots but Rick. And when the match happened and Tully interfered, Tully and Wahoo had kind of a mini feud at that point. So when Tully came out, everybody thought that Tully was going to hit Wahoo, and Wahoo ducked and ends up hitting Ricky instead. So it never dawned on anybody that they were working together at that time.
No, it came completely out of the blue, I think. Let's talk a little bit about the announcers. Now, we were saying off the air, I mean, we all love Bob Caudle. David Crockett was doing the first show that we watched all by himself. Bob Caudle did the second show by himself. I personally am not a big fan of the one-man booth at all. It's one guy. I mean, it's almost like one guy talking to himself. I don't understand why they just didn't have David Crockett and Bob Caudle. Any thoughts from you on that, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, I think David Crockett kind of needed somebody to keep him in line, and Bob Caudle's the perfect guy to do that. I agree. I always like the two-man setup. I don't know why they went away from that. I mean, it was kind of weird, because that hadn't been the model. I mean, you had, Rich Landrum over the years, and so. I don't know what the thinking was there and what, why they went that route, but I definitely prefer the two-man crew. I just thought it was, gives you different perspectives. It doesn't let one kind of try to, stand out too much or feel like they had to do too much to carry the program. Just way smoother with two guys.
Sean, your thoughts?
I normally would agree with both of you, and in 90% of the cases I do. But one of the exceptions you just happen to have in the Carolinas. Very few guys can do a one-man booth, and Bob Caudle's one of them. Bob is, he's a joy to watch. And I was just mentioning before we got in the air, there's really it's like Lance Russell. There's no bad footage. And something else they did with that Bob that I loved was that like Lance, he would never lie to the crowd, to the fans. And one of the examples, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but there's clearly an episode where it's Johnny Weaver in a mask. And he comes out as a different name. And Bob he doesn't say it's Johnny Weaver in a mask. He goes, "This is, of course, a man we all have known for many years. And I'm assuming you're familiar with his style." And, it's like, okay, we know it's Johnny. So he's basically admitting, okay, we know. But he always had that credibility, much like Lance did. So that's one of the reasons why he did work in a one-man booth for me. And the fact that he's just a magnificent storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I believe just having two guys out there. I think three is too many, which is, what the WWE does now. And I think that, two is the perfect number. Hey, I want to get back to Wahoo for a minute because I want to get your perspective on something, Tyler. Seeing as, this is what you grew up with and you experienced it. Wahoo left shortly after losing the United States title to Magnum Ta. Like, how did that get over with you? Like, I mean, it was almost like, okay, Wahoo had this great big push, getting the U.S. title. It lasted, I want to say, around 9 months, and then he vanishes. What happens?
For me, Wahoo just kind of I never connected that much with Wahoo, and I liked Wahoo, but he wasn't a huge loss. I mean, you had you had so much other stuff going on. Again, I mean, it's kind of like I was saying with guys moving out. I mean, it was just Dusty was really good in his booking about you didn't necessarily miss what happened last week because you were so excited to see what was going to happen that week. I mean, it was, even if you had to, for me, like one of the programs came on at midnight. I'm like 9, 10 years old, at this point, and I'm trying to find ways to get my mom and dad to let me stay up to see what was happening. And it wasn't to see who was gone. It was to see who was coming in, So it wasn't that big of a thing to me.
All right. That makes sense. Now, getting a little bit off the 1984 subjects, I want to get your perspective on this, Tyler. Towards the end of 1985, Wahoo comes back as a babyface. Did they ever offer an explanation for that, or just, Wahoo's back and he's a good guy again?
Yeah, nothing that I recall there. I know, within 6-7 months, he was getting title shots at Flair. Finally, I guess. But when Wahoo came back, he seemed like he aged 5 years in 12-month period or 15 months, however long it was. He just seemed kind of like. I know he always said he hated the Buddy Hackett or whatever comparison, but he just kind of seemed like he was just, during that time you had the Rock and Roll Express. I mean, they had gone really young. Rock and Roll Express were big, the Midnights, the Road Warriors were in, and then Wahoo kind of comes in and he just sort of stuck out like a sore thumb at that point to me.
I can't help but agree. That was one time when, I kind of noticed that, okay, Wahoo's getting on in years. I mean, like I said, I thought he was a great heel. I enjoyed the stuff. It just didn't look right to me with Wahoo being the bad guy. But what can I say? Sean, any thoughts that you want to share on Wahoo?
Yes, two quick ones. One, it did make sense. You're right. It didn't make sense if it was like the angle made sense. That's why it made sense. Wahoo had a point.
Yeah.
Wahoo had a completely legitimate point. No one was giving him title shots. And, he tried to be a good guy about it. He tried to go with a legitimate route about it. So he goes and he gets the U.S. title. Then this little flub up with Tully happens. And he gets the thing stripped. And you're sitting there as a fan. You're like, uh-oh. Because, I mean, at some point you're seeing, and as you said, they tried to do the same thing with Wrestling 2 in Georgia, but it never worked. But here it worked because it made sense. And everything along the line made sense. That's why the heel turn worked. Because once you start, finally you're like, oh, he's snapping now. But it fit. And when he left, did he leave to take the booking job in Florida?
I know he was the booker there, so probably that was probably what was dangled in front of him. I know he almost got into it with Hercules Hernandez backstage, and that would not have been pretty.
I could see the booking.
Dudes.
I could see the booking job in Florida in 1985 aging somebody 5 years.
Yeah, he did.
Excellent point. So anyway, all right. So Sean, you brought up some interesting questions. Barry Windham and Mike Rotundo are getting pushed. What was the plan for them? I don't know if you guys know this. I know the plan for Barry Windham was that he was going to get Magnum TA's push, and that's why on one of the shows he did a very quick Magnum TA like squash. And of course, Barry wound up leaving for the WWF. He wasn't happy with his money. Let me ask Tyler this. What was your thought on Magnum TA coming in and getting that like mega push in 1985? I mean, he wasn't even on TV, and this is September 84, and March 85, he's already the United States champion.
Well, I mean, Magnum was an exciting guy. I mean, like you said, they set him up perfect because he had the quick matches. He'd come in off the ropes, bang, belly to belly, and 3 count. And, the one thing that I always loved about Crockett TV and how they shot it, the roof every week looked like it was absolutely going to blow off of the arena. I mean, the fans were just crazy. It was loud as, And so, to me, Magnum comes in, he's like, it was almost like a Goldberg type thing where it was just this phenomena where he was where he was, he was doing those quick squashes. I mean, he seemed like a legit guy to me. And I'd read about him in the magazines and the Mr. Wrestling 2 angle and everything out of the Mid-South. And so, it was, when the Magnum came in, it was like, okay, I've read about this guy. Let's see what he can do. He was exciting. He didn't waste a lot of time getting stuff done, and he had a great look. So for me, Magnum, with seeing him come in, that was totally believable to me.
Sean, what are your thoughts? Magnum TA, the mega push he got in 85 in Mid-Atlantic.
Oh, it's absolutely that. This was the push because you said that in the second show on the 29th, he had one of those matches, and he did. And Bob Caudle referenced during that match that this is the second of these type of matches, which was the 3 drop kicks, bulldog, whatever. And that's the Jim Brunzell, 1977-78 push. 30 seconds in and out. I mean, so I'm guessing he's going for. And they're not paying him? Really? You have him in mind as a main eventer within a year, and they're shortchanging the guy?
I mean, that's Barry's side of the story anyway. But yeah, Magnum to me went from a guy who was, just kind of a middle of the card guy in Florida in 1983. He held the tag team titles with Brad Armstrong. And then he comes to Mid-South and they just give him that golden push. Watts gave it to him. And I remember Watts talking about it. He's like, I spent all this time building this guy up as a star, making him the North American champion. And then he gets a call, the opportunity to go home and be the main eventer in Crockett. And he's like, what am I going to say? I'm going to lose this guy. One thing, Tyler, I wanted to ask you, Barry Windham, if he had stayed and had gotten the push that Magnum got, which he was supposed to get, how do you think he would have gotten over, both short-term and long-term?
I think Barry would have been a great fit. I mean, there's no debating the talent the guy had. He was over with the girls. But he still kind of almost like the Fabs kind of thing where he was the guys, he still had a credibility with the guys, but he was, all the girls were in love with Barry Windham. I think he would have done well. I think he could have done as well as Magnum did in that role, maybe better. Or personally, I always personally favored him over Magnum. I think he would have been able to carry that load easily.
Yeah, I am inclined to agree. I think, Barry was young and he had a Blackjack Mulligan in his ear, and I think he made some career decisions that weren't the greatest. By the way, right around this time, during the series, they had a clip of a Wahoo Mcdaniel versus Manny Fernandez match. and they were like, well, it was supposed to be Wahoo against Blackjack Mulligan, but Mulligan's not here. And what happened was Dusty had, was going to bring Blackjack in and give him a big push. And, Blackjack, he winds up, quitting pretty much every promotion he's ever been in. Mm-hmm. But I mean, do you remember them bringing back Blackjack? And what are your thoughts on that, Tyler?
I don't remember that. I was watching that. I was like, I was thinking to myself, I even tried to look up a little bit. I don't remember Blackjack. I didn't remember any mention of that at all. It was kind of subtle the way Wahoo did it. I have zero recollection of that.
All right, that's cool. What they did was they had this bizarre video of Ric Flair.
Oh, yeah, I remember that now.
All right, dressed like Ric Flair,
in a suit.
Up. Yeah, with this giant medallion that also kept the bullets off of him, and he shows up at this dude ranch, and they're playing guitar, and they've got a campfire, and someone's playing the guitar so loud that you can't hear Flair talking. It was just an awesome disaster of a video. But yeah, Mulligan was supposed to come in and get pushed.
I do remember that. Okay, yeah, Flair's in like a suit, took a limo out into the middle of wherever, Texas, and they're by the campfire, the beans and the harmonica. Oh yeah, camping.
It was a crazy dusty production. Sean, give me your thoughts on Blackjack Mulligan.
They loved the angle so much they did the exact same thing a year and a half later with Dusty coming to the this mysterious. And by the way, Dude Ranch? What dude? I don't even remember seeing a ranch. They were like in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
You're sitting there like, what? Did somebody have a GPS? How did you find the guy? I mean, he just kind of shows up. He goes, "There you are." And even Jack's like, "How'd you get here?" I'll be honest with you. Anything I've seen Jack at this point, like in the late 70s, anytime in the 70s, good. Early 80s, fine. At this point, the guy's toast.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at his Florida stuff from this time, it's bad.
I agree with you. Blackjack, he was a good talker and he was a big guy. He had the gimmick. Dusty liked him legitimately. And I just don't know what happened here. All right, let's talk about they're starting to build up Starrcade 84. Now, when I first read there was going to be a Starrcade 84, I got very excited because I thought the first one was a one-off. I mean, Tyler, any recollections from you about, did you say, oh, wow, there's going to be another Starrcade, or were you expecting it?
I wasn't really expecting it because, at the time, it wasn't like you get a pay-per-view every year. I mean, it was the first of its kind. So, the first really big kind of push thing. I know they had super cards and things like that on Thanksgiving and Christmas and stuff like that. But, it would never really dawned on me they were going that route. But the thing with Starrcade is for months and months after Starrcade. So you're talking January, February, March of 84 after the original Starrcade. They had these, they weren't programs, but they were like almost like a brochure you would get about Starrcade that they would hand out at the house shows. And you would like get a free one, buy a Ric Flair picture and they would throw one of those in for free. So Starrcade seemed like it was, the Super Bowl or the World Series or whatever. I mean, it was a big deal. So in hindsight, it doesn't surprise me that they wanted to go back to that well again. But at the time, it hadn't dawned on me that they would have made that an annual event because it just wasn't a thing at that point.
No, and I mean, that's the thing. I was, blindsided when I saw in the magazines, wow, there's going to be another Starrcade. Then not long after that, boom, I read in Wrestling Eye that there's going to be another WrestleMania, which blew my mind. Now, Sean and I have talked about this on the show.
Actually, can I insert one thing on that, John? The one thing that's special about what they were doing with Starrcade 84, and I don't think it's ever been done before, with the possible exception of the West Coast Battle Royals, is that they're promoting Starrcade. They have no matches.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in '83, they promoted Starrcade around Flair going after the title.
Yes.
There are no matches here. They're just promoting a super card coming up at a random date, and a bunch of guys saying, wow, we have a lot of competition here. It's going to be a great card. There are no matches. I've never heard of that before, of them up until that time. Now it's common, but up until that time, I have never heard a card promoted as the card. I mean, how did that sound to you, Tyler, at the time? I mean, that seems very different to me. It seems similar now, but then.
Well, look at it. I mean, if you look at so here we're in late September. Starrcade's always around, Thanksgiving, or it was at the time. And so we're talking 2 months later, your big feuds during the September card, none of those kind of had their blow off or really, other than Jimmy Valiant and Paul Jones, but that feud went on for 100 years. But, none of the stuff that was happening in these September episodes ever translated into the Starrcade card. So it wasn't. It was almost like it was kind of thrown together. I mean, I'm sure there was a long-term plan, but you sure couldn't see it by this time in the year.
Sean, you just made, such an outstanding point, and I've never thought of that before. Prior to Starrcade 84, it had always been that, okay, we have this match that we need to put in a stadium because it's so big, whether it be Kerry versus Flair, Bruno versus Briscoes, etc. Now we've completely reversed that around. Now we have a show, and we need a foot big enough to fit in this show.
And people are competing to get on the show. That dynamic has never happened in wrestling before that I know of.
No, you're right. I cannot. I've been sitting here like rattling my brain trying to think of, first we have the stadium, then we have the matches. It used to be the other way. It was always the other way around as far as I know.
And that nicely leads us to the point, John, that you were about to make, which I'm pretty sure I know what you're about to ask right now. So, excuse me, please take back the baton.
Okay, I was going to ask Tyler. Now, Sean and I have discussed this on the show before. I think the main event of Starrcade 84 was the right main event. I think you have Ric Flair, the biggest heel in the entire NWA, not just the Mid-Atlantic area, against the biggest babyface in the NWA, Dusty Rhodes. Sean thinks it should have been Ric Flair against Wahoo McDaniel. You know what? Let me step aside. Sean, make your case.
That was your hottest feud all year. That's your hottest heel. You have these. It was basically a face-on-face match because Rick's pretty much was the face at this point because he was feuding with Wahoo. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have Dusty. It was based on the $1 Million Challenge that they threw in at the last second. There was no emotion behind the thing at all. Wahoo was a white-hot feud. That's your main event. What are they doing? They basically took a sterilized version of Starrcade and they just drained it of all emotion.
What are your thoughts, Tyler? In the main event.
I think they got it right. And the reason why is when Dusty came in, I mean, he was a larger than life kind of guy, like a Hogan. I mean, he really was. People weren't you got to look at it. You can't look at it you got to look at the fact that when Dusty first came to Crockett, he hadn't been pushing himself for 3 years where people were starting to get tired of it. Dusty was a big deal. I mean, you can see from that September 22nd episode, Dusty's out in the crowd. He just had that charisma. He was larger than life. I mean, no way you couldn't put him in there with Flair. I mean, the business was getting white hot at that point in time with WrestleMania, coming around, and the WWF was ramping up. I think you had to go. Wahoo Flair, they've been done so many times in the Carolinas over the years. I think Dusty was the way to go, personally.
All right. Let me ask you a question. Did you attend the closed circuit of Starrcade 84?
No, I did not. I couldn't get my dad to take me to hardly anything. I could get him to take me to a couple of the local high school gym things, but no way he was going to sit through that. Closest I came was Starrcade 86. I got him to sit through that, but Great American Bash 86 in Richmond was the closest I got him to sit through a long show.
All right. Now, I just have to keep in mind, you said you were like 8 or 9 years old at this point. So
right.
Just get whatever you want at that age. All right. So let me ask another question here. Dusty Rhodes, he comes in, he gets the mega push. Had he been in the Carolinas, and I guess this question is for both of you, I'll let Tyler start. Had Dusty been in Mid-Atlantic since he lost the NWA title to Flair in 1981?
Unless it was like a one-off, a shot or something, not that I can recall ever seeing. Not that I can recall.
Okay, Sean, do you remember anything? I know he was in and out. Dusty was in and out of the Carolinas. Like he would make special appearances, going back to the 70s, and I just can't remember him being there and doing anything since 81. Can you remember anything?
Outside of special attractions, and then there may have been some exposure from Georgia TV. Because Tyler, did you pick up Georgia TV?
So you guys are going to laugh. Jim Cornette came to one of the high schools in my county, and one of the lines he used is, "You guys are so far back in the sticks, your newspapers are yellow when you get them already." So that's how far back in the sticks I was. We didn't even have cable at my house until 1989. But my grandmother, who lived in town, did have cable. So I started watching Georgia wrestling once I figured out it was on TBS around that 84 time frame when the Legion of Doom, the Spoiler, Jake Roberts, Tommy Rich, the Mr. R angle with Ted DiBiase. That's when I started catching Georgia live.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you would do what I would do sometimes and go to someone's house who had cable.
Exactly.
When we first, funny cable story. No, I don't know if it's that funny. As soon as we moved from North Attleboro to Nashua, New Hampshire, this was September 1979. The first thing we did was call the cable company, and they said, "Well, we got a long way. It's going to be a while." And by a while, I mean like February 1980. I come home from school and the cable box is there. So to say the cable was highly in demand is a major understatement.
Yeah, we wanted it, and my dad, who was a big sports guy. I mean, diehard. We did have an antenna on the top of our house that had one of those dials, where you would turn it and it would aim towards Richmond, or then it would aim back towards DC, because those were the stations we would get. We did have an antenna, but he begged and begged and begged, and even thought about getting one of those ginormous satellite dishes they used to have back in the day, that were like 12 feet across. But they wouldn't run the cable. We kind of lived up on a hill, and they wouldn't run it up the hill. It wasn't cost effective for them.
Wow, that's crazy. I mean, let me ask you this. You're saying at this point you're like 8-9 years old in 1984, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Does it drive you crazy that like you weren't, by the time you were old enough to say, okay, I'm taking the car, I'm going to wrestling, that you basically, what was there when you were a kid was gone by then?
Yeah, it really was. So I turned 16 in 1991. So, by then it was pretty bad. I mean, I always liked the WWF, but it was always secondary for me. It was always kind of like, I'll watch it, but I would watch Glow too. So, put that into perspective. But Crockett was the focus. By the time I was able to drive myself, it was downhill. I think the first main or who was in, and maybe the SST was around in that point in time, or some of the cars we were going to. So, I didn't really have a lot of options. My dad, he hated wrestling, and they would always put it in. It would always come to Harrisonburg High School, which is in the Harrisonburg High School gym, which incidentally is where Ralph Sampson played his high school basketball. But it was about 30 minutes from where I grew up, and they would advertise in the local paper in the classifieds. And when my dad would see that it was in there, he would hide the paper from me, so I wouldn't know it was there. But I could get him to drive me to that. And, so once every, whatever it was, 6 or 7 weeks, they would do a spot show there, and we would go check it out. But, that's kind of how my fandom was with at the time.
Oh, I have similar stories. I mean, I grew up with WWF wrestling like a mile down the street every Friday night, Jack Witchy Sports Arena in North Attleboro, which I think might have burned down 40 years ago exactly to this day. And my parents forbade me to go. It was out of the question. And as a result, I only went 4 times. But we are running out of time. Unfortunately, this is always the fastest hour of my week. Tyler, thank you so much for being a guest. It was a great show. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right. No worries, sir. Sean, thank you for all you do for this show. I mean, right today, he sent me like this detailed thing of everything that went on the television. It made my life a little bit easier. So thank you for all you do. I want to thank Lou Kippelman, our producer. He does an excellent job behind the scenes. I'm in front of the camera. Sean's in front of the camera, so to speak. Lou is the guy behind it, and a lot of this. If you enjoy this show, you owe Lou thanks. I'll just put it that way. This has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.